Hey everybody, I'm Connor Habib and I'm so excited to welcome you to Against Everyone with Connor Habib. This is the very first episode ever in the history of humankind. So I think that's kind of a big deal. To me it is. And also, I'm recording this on June 2nd, 2017, which happens to be International Whores Day and also in the US, National Donut Day. So really just a celebration of two things that are very exciting to me and that I love. Whores and donuts. The format for the show, in case you don't know, is that every month there's going to be at least 2 episodes. One will be an episode like this where I give a little mini lecture. The other will be an episode where I am in conversation with one of the great thinkers, rebels, weirdos, whatever of our time, basically something that's smarter than me, and we're going to go deep on topics, issues, whatever. You can also get a 3rd episode every month by signing up for my Patreon. That episode will be more informal, more personal. You can get all kinds of stuff by signing up for the Patreon that supports this show. It's patreon.com/Connor Habib. I will put the information down below. Anyway, this episode of Against Everyone with Connor Habib is entitled Against Everyone. There's a reason for that. I want to talk about 2 things that are on people's minds a lot that I think are expressed really well by the title. And one is pleasure and the other is resistance. And I mean, pleasure is always on your mind because it's always on your mind. It's always there. It's always us seeking to understand what we want, to go for what we want, develop it, so we can feel good in our lives. I mean, I'm not saying any radical thing by saying pleasure's on your mind. Political resistance is probably on your mind because, I don't know if you've noticed this, but people claim that we're living in a politically volatile time, and I know that that's on a lot of people's minds, how to resist, what to do in this moment. But we often have trouble bridging the two. How do I live in this serious, volatile time and still just do things that make me feel good, do what I want, go for what I want? I might even feel guilty about that sometimes in the face of unfolding events. So today, I'm going to talk about a very basic way in which these 2 things are linked, and I'm going to do that by using the title of the show as a simple way to understand how pleasure and resistance can be bridged. And after that, so I'm going to talk about the 2 meanings of the title of the show, and then I'm going to talk about a thinker from the late 18th, early 19th century who's largely forgotten in this country, this really amazing guy who I think is really important for our moment, and I think can give us a lot to consider when it comes to pleasure and resistance. Finally, I'm going to lead you through an exercise that can bridge the 2 things for you just right there as you watch or listen to me talk about this stuff. So, just to recap the 2 meanings of the show, the thinker, that's really cool, and then the exercise that we can do together. All right. So, the first meaning of the show, the title of the show, Against Everyone with Connor Habib, I chose this name because it was, really deeply reflective of my most comfortable political positioning, which is being against everyone. Calling out the bullshit, calling out the bad politics, the bad ideas, the 8 bajillion terrible think pieces. I can feel like I'm against the world right now. I think a lot of us have that feeling, about the state of things. And resistance is really important, Standing up to stuff is really important. And I think that there's a lot of great work being against stuff, a lot of great work going on in resistance movements. But there's also a trap embedded in resistance. So I want to talk about that, the sort of limits of resistance, because resistance isn't enough on its own. What happens is if we end up just sort of saying what we don't want all the time, I don't want this kind of world, I don't want that kind of world, I don't want this policy or that policy, we can end up being defined merely by what we're against. As a result, what we're against ends up giving us our identity, our sense of meaning. If the thing that we were against went away, we would lose a primary part of our identity. That's what happens when we stay in resistance for too long. We end up sort of living in our wounds. Our wounds are what give us meaning. Let me give you a mundane example so this makes a little more sense. I'm sure you have a friend who has a shitty boyfriend. Okay, so has had a shitty boyfriend for a while. I'm not talking about an abusive boyfriend. I'm just talking about just regular old deadbeat kind of jerk. And your friend, he or she, is always complaining about this guy and, tells you these stories and tells you everything that's sort of going wrong and what she or he has to put up with. And you're like, right on, I get it. Your boyfriend sucks. Break up with your boyfriend. That's your advice, and that advice starts gathering around your friend, and eventually the pressure builds up, and he or she finally does break up with her boyfriend. And you're really excited because you're like, awesome, you did it. You got out of that shitty relationship, and of course you're also probably very excited to be relieved of these stories of woe. And so in about a month, your friend finds someone else, and things are going awesome in that new relationship with your friend. But then a little bit in, you start hearing the same stories again, and they're about the same things, the same kinds of stories, the same kinds of complaints. So what you're encountering there is you're starting to see how your friend defines herself or himself by resistance. They're recreating the conditions that they resisted in before. They might be doing it by finding a partner that was like their last partner, or they might be doing it by forcing those conditions to happen somehow, or just projecting them onto the person that we're with. They want things to be shitty, again, because it gives them the kind of maneuvering in life that they understand, the kind of resistance that they can understand. And that can happen politically too. We can want on this sort of world stage to just resist because it gives us a sense of meaning. This was expressed really beautifully in the work of the French philosopher and psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Now, Lacan has had a really profound effect on my life. He's been a really important figure in my life. So he's probably going to come up a bit in this series, but he's also very complex and complicated, so I'm not going to go into him that deeply right now. I'm just going to give a little gobbet of his work to you right now. And what I'm going to refer to as happening in the late 60s in France. So in May of 68, you may have heard of this revolution that happened in May of 68 in France. And it's a really sort of complex thing. I'm not going to go into it, but a big part of it were student protesters. And Lacan was such a big figure in France at the time. And these student protesters wanted from this public intellectual educator a response to what was happening. He said a few things, but the most interesting thing he said about a year later. There's actually some dispute as to when he said this, but let's just go with the year later version of the story. What Lacan said was something that people did not like. He said, what you aspire to as revolutionaries is a new master. What you aspire to as revolutionaries is a new master. So, see, what he was saying was, yeah, you're saying that you want change, but what you want to change really is you just sort of want to swap out this one oppressive face with another. You want this new master in place. You want to kick the old one out and have a new one in. And we can see that in that statement, that kind of dependency on resistance, the dependency on the thing that's creating the conditions of resistance to give meaning. So again, if your sense of purpose comes from resisting, you're always going to seek conditions that excuse or support the kind of resistance that you understand. And so I think we should abandon this notion of revolution as the primary mode of how we act politically. I mean, revolution, that resisting, that just means, you can imagine a wheel revolving in space, but literally it even means to roll back. I don't think people want to be defined by what they don't want. I think in general, people don't find fulfillment from just sort of being null spaces or, basically these sort of black holes of their negative thoughts, as sexy as that sounds. I think we could instead be defined by what we want, and what we can make explicit about what we want. That could give us our meaning. So the other meaning of Against Everyone with Connor and Habib is here too. It's the one I prefer. It's the one that's a little bit hidden. And that is, I'm pressed up against everyone. We're coming together. It could be in an embrace, could be in conversation, holding. Of course, it could happen through fucking, which is my favorite way of being against somebody. I'm entwined with you sexually. If I'm thinking in those terms, then I'm against everyone, against you if I'm lucky. I think this is pretty fitting for me, and I also think it's fitting for how to start the conversation of bringing pleasure into all of our talk about resistance or having a new kind of politics. It's basically figuring out how to start with resistance, but then turning away from that meaning and finding a new meaning. How do we begin with desire? How do we make a politics out of what we want instead? What we want to be pressed up against instead of what we merely don't want. It's a judo here. See, it's taking the urge to resist and then turning it into the urge to meet, to feel, to have pleasure with, to encounter. What do I want? For me, pleasure is, and especially the pleasure that comes from interacting with other people, connecting with other people, that's what I want. It's extremely important. It's all erotic to me, these kinds of encounters. Whether it's physical contact like sex, whether it's conversation, which has this erotic dimension. I mean, conversation is free. It can go anywhere at any moment. It's varied with different people. It feels different. You might have it with someone and not like it one day, but that doesn't mean you're not going to try it again with that same person. It could be the encounter, the coming together and connecting like this, where I'm speaking to you through your computer and you're hearing me in your headphones or whatever. I'm actually your sort of ear vibrator. These vibrations are turning into and becoming meaning and concepts inside of you. It could be just the coming together, the pleasurable coming together of you imagining me or me imagining you in our minds, that commingling. That's what I want. So I'm not saying that that's what everybody wants, although I think a lot of people do want that, but that's what I want, the pleasurable, erotic encounter. I often say there are only 3 things I care about in life: books, fucking, and conversation. And that's why I made those 3 things my job. But that also is a statement about my politics, I think. How do I make a world that's easier to read, to fuck, and to talk in? Thinking along these lines of what we want can be really challenging. Building a politics and a way to resist or move past resistance in our minds based on what we want, that's difficult. And part of that is because we're afraid to want what we want. We don't really have models for that in our lives. We don't have people that have really gone for that. I mean, there are people, and I'm going to talk about some of them, but they're not omnipresent in our lives. And, another reason why, aside from just not having models, is that sort of glorification of the victim mode of just resisting, it's out there in a lot of ways, subtle ways. One way is just by the way that activists, particularly leftists, will just cancel out pleasure as something that's worthwhile together. They're like, pleasure, it's bourgeois, it's some capitalist commodity, blah, blah, blah. And they end up falling in line with the austerity of religious fundamentalists in many ways because of this. So I'm going to tell you about someone that I think is a really great model for bringing pleasure and resistance together. It's someone who inspires me, who helps me consider the bridge there. And then I'm going to lead you through an exercise that I think might help. Someone who's particularly great about bringing together pleasure and resistance and particularly great at imagining a world that is based on what we want rather than what we don't want, is this utopian thinker from the late 18th, early 19th century named Charles Fourier. Fourier was someone who was just overwhelming with passions. What he wanted was to remake the entire world and have it be founded on pleasure. So just think of that. What would the world look like if it were founded on pleasure? That was Fourier's great idea. He started with resistance. Okay, so he started where a lot of us started. Particularly, he was resistant to monogamy, to marriage, and to sexual austerity. He was actually rather advanced for his time, if you think about that. So in the late 18th, early 19th century, here's this guy that's basically a queer theorist. But he moved on from his ideas of resistance and onto a vision that was so profound and so just fucking weird and bonkers that it can't help but inspire something in you. He said, and I love this quote, I carry this quote around with me inwardly as sort of a guiding star. Our fault is not, as has been believed, to desire overmuch, but to desire too little. Our fault is not, as has been believed, to desire overmuch, but to desire too little. If we just paid more attention to what we wanted, a world would grow out of that. Fourier stayed as true as he knew how to his desirous, lustful, pleasurable vision as possible. And so some of his visions were really mind-boggling. Fourier, for instance, imagined a world where there was a sexual minimum, where everybody had access to at least a certain amount of sex. That we, in this world, would feel erotic pleasure in our everyday lives with everything we did. Our jobs would just feel erotic. It would be like just an orgasm all day. We would try out various sexual positions. We would try new sexual acts. There would be all these new orientations that the sort of range of sexual orientations really puts Kinsey to shame. I mean, it makes it seem super simplistic. He said that beautiful people would have sex with ugly people because beautiful people didn't own their own beauty. And in fact, entire ideas of property were very different because of everything was based on pleasure. War was obsolete. The state was just sort of there to make us feel good. The state was there for us, to help us feel pleasure. We would have oceans that tasted like lemonade. There were planets, bisexual planets, making love with one another. It was this cosmic vision. It was huge. And he just goes on complexifying everything from the universe down to, the way we dress. That's why this literary critic, Roland Barthes, called Fourier a formulator. He really was a formulator who's formulating something new at every turn, every step. I realize you might be thinking here, okay, Connor, oceans of lemonade, what the hell? That is completely crazy. Of course, you're right. Of course it's crazy. And of course, you might even think it's stupid. Of course. Then again, why such an intense reflexive response to imagining something better and more exciting? I mean, unless you don't like lemonade, in which case, I get it. I don't really like lemonade either, but if it were grape Kool-Aid, I would totally be on board. The whole point, though, is that he was envisioning, he was formulating intensely. Nothing had to be taken for granted. Nothing was taken for granted by Fourier. He was aspiring us not toward practicality, but toward creativity based on what he wanted. It's the impossibility that makes it so important, because right now, in our landscape, we dream in marginality. We dream in incremental steps. We don't need to. Because as long as we're only able to envision marginal incremental change, that's all that will be available to us. There are other thinkers like Fourier, and some of them are alive today. The comic book writer and occultist Grant Morrison, for instance, he has this great story about how his parents were anti-war activists when he was a kid, and they were always sort of talking about the bomb, how to stop the bomb. How to stop bombs being dropped. And he said at some point he realized, it clicked for him, that the bomb was an idea before it was built and became reality. So it was in idea form before it sort of materialized. And Superman was also an idea. So why not push for the sort of grander, more amazing idea of this person who was flying around the world with superpowers, saving the cosmos as well as just, saving your cat when it was stuck in a tree. There is the filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky, also an occultist and comic book writer. You should watch this documentary about him called Jodorowsky's Dune. It's just excellent. Oscar Wilde is a great example, or Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher. Even G.K. Chesterton, who was a Catholic critic and writer. Chesterton has this great quote about trying to stay true to your vision. He says, "The vision is always a fact. It is the reality that is often a fraud." The vision is always a fact. It is the reality that is often a fraud. So that's another one I like to carry around with me. See, there's this whole path out there of people sort of holding this frequency of what do I want as the starting place for how to act in the world. Let me walk the path of what I want. That frequency sort of opens up the grass, opens up the path for you to walk on. It's this sort of song that you can follow through life. To illustrate how this works out politically, I'm going to give you a quick exercise that you can do, and then I'm going to walk myself through the exercise in front of you so it makes a little bit more sense. It's an exercise that seems very simple. So close your eyes. Go ahead, close them. It's fine. I mean, unless you're driving, then don't close them. But close your eyes and start to imagine something that you want. What does the world you want look like? Don't settle for anything less than what you want. What does the world you want look like? And don't base it on what you don't want. Envision it positively. You're going to find yourself defining it based on all the sort of obstacles that are in the way that people and institutions in power have put there telling you, oh no, that's not practical, it's not practical. So you might think of, I want more women in STEM, or I want access to education for all kids. A lot of that is based on the conditions you don't want now, and you're told that you have to want things like that. The second step is then you roll it back. That's where the revolution part comes in. You start seeing those things that are in the way of your vision, and you figure out how to step along that path, but keeping your vision in mind. This will all make more sense when I go through mine, okay? So, for instance, here's me coming up with an example of this, of me running through this exercise. So, I want a world where the naked body is totally celebrated. We love our bodies. We enjoy the infinitely generative pleasure that they allow us. And we have sex with each other out in the open, wherever we want, because it's understood that that kind of commingling is a beautiful celebration of life and pleasure. Okay, now look, I know that there's a lot of stuff in the way between here and there. And one of the first things that comes to mind is, okay, yes, but if people were just sort of fucking on the sidewalk, then other people would see that and they would be sort of damaged by not consenting to see people fucking on the sidewalk. Okay. But I am envisioning a world where the naked body is not threatening, but however, I do see that right now it is threatening. That images of sex are threatening, and particularly to women, because men in our world are using sex as a weapon against women, are using sex as a way to wield power against women, and other men as well, but women are particularly bearing the brunt of this. And so I'm going to need to work on that. If I want to live in the world where my big vision exists. I'm going to need to work on laws that encourage sex phobia, encourage sex negativity, repress people, imprison sex workers, all that kind of stuff, regulate sexual imagery and porn. I'm going to have to work on all that. I'm going to have to work on the cultural battles, all that kind of stuff. It's a big thing. There's a lot of stuff to hit as I go along. Of course, I'm not going to be working on my own, but there's a lot to work on. The thing is, that vision is what gives me so much pleasure, and that's where I want to start, because I can just start working on these little things and completely lose sight, or worse yet, never even have a vision of where I'm going with all my actions. Why is this important? I'm not just trying to be the sort of Tony Robbins of politics here, although I think there's probably some crossover. What I'm trying to say is there are people who are trained to seize moments like this and utilize politically volatile moments like this and utilize them to create the new narrative, the new vision, and just tell us what we want. So right now in this politically volatile moment, there's lots of resistance happening. There's lots of chaos, or a sense of chaos, a sense of uncertainty, instability, all that. There are people who have trained their whole lives, who are in the margins, have trained their ways through sort of political training, public speaking, how to seize power, how to rally people, all that kind of stuff. They have connections, they're networked in, that are just excited about moments like this because this is their chance to seize power. And part of the way they seize power is by relying on the fact that we don't have a vision. We don't have a pleasurable vision. We just have ideas of what we're resisting, what we don't want. So they can storm in and be the hero by sort of disposing of some marginal or incremental thing we don't want. That's why so many revolutions end up having, some brutal military dictator replacing the previous brutal military dictator, or one party takes over where one political party takes over where the last political party left off, and there are slight or small differences in between them, but not that many. And then, as the cycle goes on, we're still choosing between a lesser of two evils, blah, blah, blah. What's up to us is to have this great pleasurable vision, so we don't stop at the resistance work. We don't stop when we win an incremental battle, because that's not really our goal. The goal is this bigger, more exciting, pleasurable thing. So we have to become formulators of the entire world the way that we want it. We can find each other, we can talk to each other and work on these projects together, but the vision is ours. So creatively formulate. That's my idea here, and that's it. That's the end of the episode. Please sign up for my Patreon, and I'm going to be back in a couple weeks to talk with some awesome person. I know who it is right now, and it's somebody really awesome. I'm excited to share that with you. All right, thanks for tuning into the first episode. Patreon.com/ConnerHabib. You are the best. Thank you.